July 4th, 1187. In a geological trap near the hills known as the Horns of Hattin, the Palestinian sun itself became a weapon. Its unbearable heat, as if focused by a scorching lens, turned the valley into a natural furnace. This wasn't just an army dying, it was an entire kingdom collapsing. And at the epicenter of this agony stood a single figure. His name was Guy de Lusignan. He was a king, and the crown of Jerusalem still rested on his head. But in the fire and smoke of the battle, it seemed a cruel mockery. His army, surrounded by Saracens, had been turned into a slaughterhouse. With lips cracked from thirst, the exhausted ruler watched the end of his reign unfold. The king was a personal witness to the death of his kingdom, and beside him, its last symbol of faith trembled. In the red royal tent, the last island of resistance, a bishop raised the greatest of all relics to the sky. A piece of the wood on which the Savior was believed to have been crucified, encased in gold and precious stones, was powerless. Even the true cross could not stop the slaughter. The artifact that had granted victories for centuries was silent today. As the holy relic failed, Guy de Lusignan's entire life flashed before his eyes. He was merely a younger son from a minor noble family in distant Poitou, initially devoid of any prospects. But divine aid, it seemed, had abandoned him now, just when the cross, which had ensured victories for centuries, had ceased to work. His current ruin was a stark contrast to his past. His career in Outremer, the fabled land beyond the sea, had been meteoric. There, where every man had a chance to succeed, Guy had gained it all. He married the king's sister, became regent, and finally wore the crown, reaching the pinnacle through a woman's love and courtly intrigue. It was the ultimate dream for any landless knight. But now, it had all turned to dust. On these scorching hills, all his achievements were burned to the ground. His army, the finest knights of the Holy Land, including the elite of the Templar and Hospitaller orders, was annihilated. Barons fell under a hail of Saracen arrows, and from a nearby hill, under his yellow banner, the architect of this catastrophe, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin, watched his triumph unfold, unperturbed. The disaster was absolute. Guy de Lusignan, the last crowned monarch to rule from Jerusalem, became the man whose name was tied to the death sentence of an entire era. The Holy City had weeks left, the kingdom mere hours. He did not yet know that fate had in store for him not death, but a shameful captivity and a paradoxical rebirth on a distant island. At that moment, he was simply the man responsible for the ruin of everything. On the hills of Hattin, he was living through his own personal apocalypse. His name was destined to become a synonym for incompetence. But history proved more complex than the simple verdict of the victors. This is a story of how high ambition can soar, and how deep into the abyss a single misstep can lead. To understand this tragedy, we must return to its origins. To understand Guy, one must look into the world that created him. He was not a child of the Holy Land. He was a product of feudal France of the 10th to 12th centuries, a world of harsh customs, strict laws, and a stifling system of inheritance known as primogeniture. These roots would define his motivations for the rest of his life. His family, the House of Lusignan, hailed from the county of Poitou, a land of troubadours and perpetually rebellious barons in western France. They were powerful lords who owned an imposing castle, but were vassals to the Dukes of Aquitaine, who in that era were the Plantagenet kings of England. And the very origin of their line was shrouded in a sinister legend. According to family myth, the founder of their line was the fairy Melusine, half woman, half serpent. She married a mortal, but left him when he broke his oath and spied on her on a Saturday, seeing her true form. This legend not only gave the Lusignans an aura of supernatural origin, but also subtly hinted at their dual and perhaps cursed nature. In reality, their character was revealed in constant rebellion. The Lusignans of the 12th century were known for their pride, violent tempers, and belligerence. They endlessly warred with their neighbors and rebelled against their overlords. Guy's father, Hugh VIII, was a typical example of this line, and he faced a serious problem: 7 sons. The problem lay in the system of primogeniture, simple and ruthless. To preserve the family's power and prevent the division of their lands, absolutely everything, lands, castle, titles, was inherited by the eldest son alone. For the younger sons, raised as aristocrats but deprived of land, this was effectively a sentence. They had no future at home. The first path open to them led to the church. A career as a priest, abbot, or bishop promised honor and considerable wealth. However, it demanded a complete renunciation of secular life, marriage, and military glory, which for the warlike and boisterous Lusignans was a deeply unattractive choice. The second path was humiliating, but offered a glimmer of hope. One could become a landless knight in the service of a king, a powerful lord, or even one's own elder brother. This path was fraught with risk and humiliation, but offered a faint chance of a fortunate marriage to a wealthy heiress, or being granted a fief for loyal service. But there was a third, most risky and tempting route. It led east to the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch. The Franks called these lands Outremer, the land beyond the sea. It was a frontier world, a place of eternal war on the border between Christianity and Islam, and therefore a world of incredible opportunities. For younger sons, Outremer was a true promised land, where the laws of primogeniture were less strict. Here, a man was valued not for his inheritance, but for the valor of his sword. A poor knight could marry the heiress to a barony, be given a city to govern, and even marry into the royal family. It was a true melting pot for adventurers. Guy de Lusignan was one such fortune-seeker. Blessed with handsome features and skilled with a sword, he was stripped of any inheritance. In France, an unenviable future in the shadow of his elder brothers awaited him. So his gaze, like that of thousands of others, was turned to the east, which became his only hope. Moreover, the Lusignans had their own history with the Crusades. Their grandfather, Hugh VII, took part in the Second Crusade. Their father, Hugh VIII, traveled to the Holy Land in 1163, where he fought in the Battle of Harim and died in the captivity of the Emir Nur al-Din. For his sons, the journey east was not only a chance for wealth, but also a matter of honor, to avenge their father. However, the immediate trigger for their departure was a crime. Around 1168, over a murky feudal dispute, the Lusignan brothers ambushed and killed Patrick, Earl of Salisbury, an influential English nobleman. In response, their overlord, the young Richard the Lionheart, exiled the brothers from his lands. Now, the path to Outremer became a necessity. Exiled, with his reputation stained, Guy set out for the east, not as a pious pilgrim, but as an adventurer with nothing left to lose. The road to Outremer had become a matter of survival. Fate had in store for him either a quiet disappearance or a rise so dizzying and a fall so devastating that it would forever write his name into history. The world he entered was full of paradoxes. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1170s was an island of the Latin West, deeply embedded in Middle Eastern soil. It was a society that had achieved incredible luxury and culture, yet lived under the constant threat of total annihilation. In its nearly 100 years of existence, it had put down deep but very fragile roots. Geographically, the kingdom was a narrow coastal strip dotted with cities whose names were sacred to the entire Christian world. The legendary Acre, Tyre, Beirut, Jaffa, life thrived in these port centers. And the crown of this world, its heart and soul, was, of course, Jerusalem. The streets of these cities were a true melting pot. Italian merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Pisa controlled the trade. Here, knights in chainmail and white burnouses for sun protection mingled with Syrian Christians, Armenian traders, Greek priests, and Jewish moneylenders. The air was a mix of Latin, French, Arabic, and Italian dialects. The ruling elite, the Frankish barons, had long ceased to be coarse European warriors. Born in this land, they spoke Arabic fluently and appreciated Eastern luxuries, baths, and cuisine. They used local medicine, which was far superior to that in Europe, and they built magnificent castles that became centers of civilization. But this prosperity was deceptive. The kingdom was demographically doomed. The Frankish Catholics, the ruling minority, numbered only 120,000 to 150,000 people amidst a much larger population of Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And beyond the borders, in Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, a new Islamic threat was gathering strength, its goal being the expulsion of the infidels. When Guy arrived at the center of this political web, the court of Jerusalem was a hotbed of intrigue and deep tragedy. On the throne sat a young man who could have become the greatest of kings, Baldwin IV, but his potential was nullified by a terrible, incurable disease. The monarch's fate would determine the fate of the entire kingdom. Baldwin ascended to the throne at 13, already aware of his diagnosis. His tutor, the historian William of Tyre, had once discovered that the boy felt no pain in his right arm. Doctors confirmed the worst: leprosy. In the Middle Ages, this was considered not just a disease but a divine punishment that made a person an outcast for life. Despite the disease relentlessly consuming his body, the young king showed incredible strength of spirit and political acumen. He personally led his troops into battle and even won a brilliant victory at the Battle of Montgisard, routing a massive army of Saladin himself with just a handful of knights. He was respected by his own barons and even by his enemies. But everyone understood his reign would be short. Baldwin could not marry and leave a direct heir. The expectation of his imminent death created deep uncertainty at court and led to the rise of two warring political factions, fiercely fighting for control over the future of the throne. The first faction, the Peace Party, was composed of the native nobility. They were led by Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, the most powerful feudal lord in the kingdom. He and his supporters from the Ibelin clan, born in the Holy Land and knowledgeable about the East, believed the kingdom was too weak for aggressive warfare. They advocated for diplomacy, truces with Saladin, and strengthening defenses, prioritizing survival over ideology. Opposing them was the Court Party, or War Party. Its unofficial leader was the king's mother, Agnes de Courtenay, and its core consisted of newly arrived knights and adventurers from Europe. They craved glory, land, and plunder, scorning the caution of the local barons as cowardice. These hawks believed that the only language the Saracens understood was force. The most flamboyant and reckless member of this party was Reynald de Chatillon. A former prince of Antioch, he possessed incredible courage, but even greater cruelty and greed. His constant pirate raids on Muslim caravans and pilgrims regularly violated any truce and provoked Saladin into retaliatory strikes. Between these two forces, like a hammer and an anvil, was the ailing King Baldwin IV. As long as he was able, he managed to restrain the ambitions of both factions. But the main question that poisoned all political life was that of succession. Baldwin had a sister, Princess Sibylla, and whoever married her would become the future king of Jerusalem. In 1180, an unknown exile from Poitou arrived in this fractured world. Guy de Lusignan had no land and no wealth. His only assets were his knightly bearing, his stunning good looks, and the support of his older brother, Aymery, who had already made a career at court. He had arrived at the right time and in the right place. His path from exile to ruler was astonishingly swift, but it was driven less by his personal talents and more by a fortunate confluence of circumstances, the patronage of powerful figures, and most importantly, an all-consuming love affair. His success was the result of external forces, not internal strength. His older brother played a key role in his rise. Aymery de Lusignan had arrived in the East earlier, and being less of a warrior and more of a clever and charming courtier, had built a brilliant career. He married the daughter of a powerful baron and was appointed constable, the commander-in-chief of the army. It was Aymery who introduced his handsome younger brother to the high society of Jerusalem. Guy's appearance at court caused a sensation. Against the backdrop of grim, scarred warriors, his classical knightly beauty, which contemporaries described as almost divine, was dazzling. And most importantly, he caught the eye of the most important person in the kingdom, the widowed Princess Sibylla. His looks became his greatest asset. As heiress to the throne and mother to a young son, Sibylla was a pawn in political games. Her first husband had died, and now the baron's party wanted to marry her to their own candidate, while her brother, King Baldwin, sought an influential European husband for her. The princess's marriage was a matter of state importance, but she decided to take her fate into her own hands. Sibylla, a passionate and strong-willed woman, fell madly in love with the handsome foreigner. This romance perfectly aligned with the interests of the court party. Agnes de Courtenay and her supporters saw Guy as the ideal candidate for king. He was noble and handsome, but had no connections among the local aristocracy, which meant he would be completely dependent on them, their perfect puppet. Events began to unfold rapidly. In the spring of 1180, Raymond of Tripoli and his allies marched with an army towards Jerusalem to force their own candidate on Sibylla. Acting preemptively, King Baldwin, succumbing to pressure from his mother and sister, hastily married Sibylla to Guy de Lusignan at Easter. When Raymond and his barons arrived, it was too late. They were faced with a fait accompli. The obscure adventurer from Poitou was now the king's brother-in-law. This marriage definitively split the kingdom. The local aristocracy was furious, viewing Guy as an unworthy upstart. The conflict between the two factions escalated into open, irreconcilable enmity. In 1182, King Baldwin's health deteriorated sharply. The leprosy was progressing. He began to go blind and could no longer lead the army himself. He was forced to appoint Guy de Lusignan as regent of the kingdom. The former exile was given full power and a chance to prove his worth. But he failed this test spectacularly. His first major test was an invasion by Saladin, provoked by another of Reynald de Chatillon's raids. Guy gathered the full might of the Frankish host at the springs of Sephoria, with every chance of victory. However, he showed extreme indecisiveness. His army stood idle for several days, allowing Saladin to ravage the lands with impunity, after which the Muslims simply left. Such passive behavior was seen as shameful and cowardly. A true disaster struck the following year. In 1183, Saladin besieged the castle of Kerak, which belonged to Reynald de Chatillon, during the wedding of Reynald's stepson. Guy again brought the army to the rescue, and the same story repeated itself. He did not dare to attack, allowing Saladin to lift the siege and withdraw unhindered. This repeated indecision was the last straw. For King Baldwin, who had crushed Saladin at the age of 16 while already ill, this was unbearable. He deemed Guy a worthless commander. In a rage, he stripped his brother-in-law of the regency and even tried to forcibly annul his marriage to Sibylla. When Guy refused to appear at court, the king personally besieged him in the city of Ascalon, publicly demonstrating his contempt. To permanently remove Guy from power, the king took a drastic step. He failed to annul the marriage, but he had his 5-year-old nephew, Sibylla's son from her first marriage, crowned as his co-ruler under the name Baldwin III. Raymond of Tripoli, the leader of the opposing party, was appointed regent for the boy. Guy de Lusignan's career seemed to be over for good. Humiliated, confined to his city of Ascalon, Guy appeared utterly defeated. But he underestimated two key factors: the tenacity of his wife and the fragility of human life. Fate was preparing a new, even sharper and more unexpected turn in his story. To understand the full depth of the drama of that era, one must focus on the figure of King Baldwin IV himself. His short, tragic life was the axis around which the entire politics of Outremer revolved. He was a fading sun, and everyone else, including Guy, was merely a shadow cast by his light. Baldwin was both a miracle and a curse for his kingdom. A miracle because his disease-ravaged body housed the spirit of a great warrior and a wise ruler. A curse because his incurable illness made the future unpredictable, turning the Jerusalem court into a viper's nest of intrigue, where everyone vied for power while awaiting his death. His reign began with a victory that wrote his name in history. In 1177, at the age of just 16, he faced a massive invasion by Saladin. The forces were unequal, but the young king, capitalizing on the Sultan's mistake, made the bold decision to attack his scattered army near Montgisard. Fighting in the front ranks despite his leprosy-afflicted hand, Baldwin led a furious charge. The true cross was carried before the army. The impact of the ironclad knights was so terrifying and unexpected that Saladin's huge army faltered and fled in a panic. The rout was complete, and the young king earned the reputation of a hero. But the disease progressed. Each year, it sapped more of his strength. The king's face became covered in sores. He went blind, and he could no longer walk. He had to be carried on a litter. Yet even in this state, confined to a stretcher, he remained the absolute ruler of his kingdom. His moral authority was so great that the mere sight of him at the head of the army was enough to strike terror into the enemy. When Saladin besieged Kerak Castle, Baldwin ordered himself to be carried on a litter at the head of his troops. Upon learning this, the Sultan, who held great respect for his adversary, lifted the siege and retreated. It was the expectations of such a man that Guy de Lusignan failed to meet. The passivity of the healthy regent in the campaigns of 1182 and 1183 was, for the half-dead but desperately brave king, not just a tactical error. It was a betrayal of the very spirit of the crusader state, the spirit of Montcrusard. Their worldviews were utterly incompatible. The dying Baldwin desperately tried to save his country. He watched as his kingdom was torn apart by intrigues. In a last attempt to prevent chaos, he crowned his young nephew Baldwin V, hoping to create a system that would outlive him. It was an act of desperation. The king's plan was meticulously crafted. He appointed Raymond of Tripoli as regent for the young heir. To maintain a balance of power, the boy's guardian was Jocelyn de Courtenay from the rival court party, and the key fortresses of the kingdom were handed over to the control of the Templar and Hospitaller orders. Moreover, trusting neither party, Baldwin IV drew up a special will. He decreed that in the event of his nephew's death, the question of succession between his sisters, Sibylla and Isabella, should not be decided by local barons, but by the highest authorities in Europe, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the kings of England and France. It was a desperate attempt to prevent a civil war. In March 1185, at the age of 24, Baldwin IV died. His heroic martyr's life came to an end. His death marked the beginning of the end for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. While he was alive, his personal authority was the dam that held back the forces of destruction. With his passing, that dam broke. The throne, as willed, passed to the sickly boy. Baldwin V of Raymond of Tripoli became regent. He immediately concluded a 4-year truce with Saladin to give the tormented kingdom a respite. However, this fragile equilibrium, created by the will of the leper king, did not last long. In the summer of 1186, the young King Baldwin V suddenly fell ill and died in Acre. The child's death blew up the political situation. His uncle's will demanded that the question of succession be submitted to the judgment of European monarchs, but the court party had no intention of waiting. For them, this was their chance to stage a coup and return their candidate, Guy de Lusignan, to power. The death of the little king was the spark that lit the powder keg. The entire complex system of checks and balances built by his uncle collapsed in an instant. This was the signal for a coup d'état to begin. The regent, Raymond of Tripoli, was in the north, in Tiberias at that moment. By law, he should have convened the high court and sent ambassadors to Europe. But he knew full well that his opponents from the court party would not sit idly by. They would act quickly, decisively, and with absolute ruthlessness. While Raymond gathered his supporters in Nablus, the conspirators in Jerusalem began their performance. At the head of the coup was Princess Sibylla herself, who revealed herself to be a powerful and cunning politician. She was supported by her uncle Jocelyn de Courtenay, the Grand Master of the Templars Gérard de Riedfort, and Reynald de Châtillon. Their plan was audacious and built on deceit. First, the conspirators organized a lavish funeral for Baldwin V in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This allowed them to gather all their supporters in the capital and effectively take control of the city. Raymond and his barons did not attend, fearing for their safety, and their absence was immediately portrayed as an act of disrespect to the deceased king. Having secured the support of the corrupt Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, the conspirators faced their main problem. The barons and the people were willing to accept Sibylla as queen, but they adamantly refused to see her husband on the throne. Guy de Lusignan's reputation after his failed military campaigns was in ruins. So Sibylla and her accomplices played a brilliant and cynical gambit. They proposed a deal. Sibylla would be crowned as the sole ruler, but she would publicly swear to immediately annul her marriage to Guy. In return, she would be granted the right to choose a new husband herself, who would then become king. The high court, assembled without Raymond and his supporters, could not refuse such an offer. At the coronation ceremony in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Patriarch Heraclius placed the crown on Sibylla's head. The first act of the drama was complete. She was officially queen. And then, the second act began immediately. Right after the coronation, the Patriarch addressed the new ruler. He reminded her that the kingdom needed a strong male ruler and invited her to name her new husband, as agreed. Sibylla took the floor and gave a speech about whom she chose to protect the kingdom. Her choice stunned everyone. To the absolute astonishment of all present, she summoned Guy de Lusignan to her side. Taking the crown from her own head, she declared that she chose Guy as her husband and lord. With the words, "Those whom God has joined, let no man put asunder," she handed him the crown and placed it on her husband's head herself. It was a brilliant and unscrupulous deception. The stunned barons realized they had been duped. They had become unwitting participants in a farce that brought to power a man they despised. The Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, one of the architects of the coup, sarcastically remarked that this coronation was his personal revenge on Raymond of Tripoli, who had once broken a promise made to him. Upon learning what had happened, Raymond's party, gathered in Nablus, was enraged. They refused to swear allegiance to Guy and proposed crowning Sibylla's half-sister, Isabella, and her husband. The kingdom was on the brink of civil war. Only one baron dared to protest openly in Jerusalem itself. But Isabella's husband, the young Humphrey of Touraine, was not an ambitious man and had no desire to participate in a rebellion. During the night, he secretly left Nablus, rode to Jerusalem, and swore fealty to Guy and Sibylla. This act broke the will of the opposition. Realizing that a civil war in the face of Saladin was tantamount to suicide, all the other barons submitted. Only Raymond of Tripoli remained steadfast. Refusing to recognize Guy as king, he departed for his own lands in Tiberias. There, in anger and resentment, he committed an act that many considered treason. He made a separate peace with Saladin. The schism in the kingdom was now complete. And so, Guy became king. He reached the pinnacle not through valor, but through his wife's cunning and the intrigues of the war party. The crown, obtained by deceit, sat uneasily on his head. He was the ruler of a divided state, despised by the best of his barons and surrounded by sycophants and adventurers. And across the border, Sultan Saladin, watching this self-destruction, patiently awaited his moment. While the kingdom of Jerusalem was consuming itself from within, a process was being completed on its borders that would become its death sentence. The previously fragmented Islamic world had found a new leader, one who possessed the talents of a great general, a wise diplomat, and an unbreakable will. His name was Saladin, and his primary goal was to expel the Franks from the Holy Land. Unlike Guy's accidental rise, Saladin's path to power was long and arduous. A Kurd by origin, he began his career in the service of the Syrian ruler Nur al-Din, who was the first to proclaim the idea of jihad. Sent to Egypt, Saladin became its ruler himself after his patron's death, and then subjugated Damascus, Aleppo, and other Muslim cities. By 1186, he had created a vast empire that squeezed the kingdom of Jerusalem in an iron grip from the south and east. He was the complete opposite of the bloodthirsty Saracen image painted by European propaganda. Deeply religious, generous, and chivalrously noble, he was an all the more dangerous enemy. The purpose of Saladin's life was the liberation of Jerusalem, or Al-Quds, as Muslims call it, the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. For a long time, he avoided full-scale war, making truces with Baldwin IV, whom he deeply respected. But with the death of the leper king and the accession of the war party led by Guy, the situation changed dramatically. The catalyst for war was Renaud de Chatillon, a man who embodied everything Saladin hated about the Franks. An adventurer who arrived with the Second Crusade, he became Prince of Antioch through marriage and then spent 16 years in Muslim captivity, which only hardened his already cruel nature. Upon his release, he made another fortunate marriage and became the lord of Ultra-Jourdain, the region east of the Dead Sea. His castle, Kerak, overlooked rich caravan routes, and Renaud, recognizing no truces, constantly plundered Muslims, considering it a godly deed. His domain was a veritable pirate base. In 1181, he carried out a particularly daring raid. Building a fleet on the Red Sea, he attacked pilgrim ships and even threatened to attack the holy city of Mecca. This act of sacrilege caused a wave of outrage throughout the Islamic world. Renaud became Saladin's personal enemy, and the Sultan publicly swore to kill him with his own hands if he ever fell into his power. In late 1186, Renaud made his final provocation. Violating the active truce, he attacked a huge and wealthy caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus, seizing immense treasures and many prisoners. This robbery was the last straw for Saladin. It became the pretext for war. Saladin sent envoys to King Guy. His demand was just and based on the terms of the truce: return the stolen goods, release the prisoners, and punish Renaud. Any reasonable ruler wishing to avoid war would have immediately complied. Guy had a chance to prevent the catastrophe. But Guy was trapped. He owed his throne to the war party, whose informal leader was Renaud. He summoned his ally and conveyed the Sultan's demand. Renaud's response was defiant and arrogant. He declared that he was the lord of his own lands and had no truce with the Saracens. Guy faced a fateful choice. Forcing Renaud to submit meant challenging his chief allies, risking political suicide and civil war. Supporting him meant starting a war with Saladin. He could not, or would not, rein in his vassal and sent Saladin's envoys away empty-handed, making the choice that sealed his fate. For Saladin, this was the perfect pretext. The king's refusal gave him the moral right to declare a holy war, not as an aggressor, but as the wronged party whose rights had been violated. He immediately began to gather troops from all corners of his empire. A massive army, the likes of which the Holy Land had never seen, was converging on the borders of Outremer. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a general mobilization was also declared. Seeing the inevitability of the threat, even Raymond of Tripoli forgot his grievances, broke his separate peace with Saladin, and joined the royal army. In the face of mortal danger, the kingdom united, but this unity was belated and very fragile. In the summer of 1187, during a particularly scorching spell, the entire military might of the kingdom was assembled at the springs of Sephoria in Galilee. It was a strategically perfect location. The abundance of water and pasture allowed the army to hold this almost unassailable position for a long time. The Christians had taken up a flawless defensive stance. The army Guy had assembled was the largest in the kingdom's history, about 20,000 men, including 200 heavily armed knights and thousands of warrior monks from the Templar and Hospitaller orders. The army was accompanied by its holiest relic, the True Cross. The Christians were completely confident in their strength. Saladin's army was larger, around 30,000 men, but he knew that a frontal assault on Sephoria was suicide. He needed to lure the Franks out of their fortified camp and into open, waterless terrain where his light and mobile cavalry would have a decisive advantage. To do this, he devised a diabolically clever bait. On July 2nd, 1187, Saladin laid siege to the city of Tiberias. The city belonged to Raymond of Tripoli, and his wife Eschiva was in its citadel. Saladin quickly captured the lower town, but the fortress held out. News of the siege caused a storm in the Christian camp, and Guy immediately called a council of war. The fate of the kingdom was decided at that council. Raymond spoke first. He knew the terrain and Saladin's tactics better than anyone. He stated bluntly that the siege of Tiberias was a trap. He was willing to sacrifice his city and even his wife to save the army. He explained that the road to Tiberias lay across a waterless plateau, and the army would die of thirst before it even reached the battle. Raymond insisted they must stay put. Saladin would soon run out of supplies and be forced to withdraw. The loss of Tiberias was a blow, he concluded, but the loss of the army would be the end of the entire kingdom. Most of the experienced barons supported him, and King Guy seemed to agree with this wise decision. But that night, his chief allies and Raymond's personal enemies, Gérard de Riedfort and Reynald de Châtillon, came to the king's tent. They accused the Count of Tripoli of treason and cowardice. Playing on Guy's insecurity and his fear of appearing indecisive again, as he had at Kerak, they convinced him to change his mind. And Guy broke. Weak and susceptible to others' influence, lacking both Baldwin's authority and Raymond's experience, Guy reversed his previous decision. He gave the order to march on Tiberias at dawn. That command was a death sentence for his army and for the entire kingdom of Jerusalem. On the morning of July 3rd, hearing the trumpets announce the march, Raymond exclaimed with bitterness that the war was over and the kingdom was lost. But as a loyal vassal, he obeyed the order and led the vanguard. The army began its 25-kilometer march into hell, across the waterless plateau under a blazing sun. Soon, the Crusaders' main enemy became an unbearable thirst. The water in their skins ran out quickly. Their heavy armor heated up in the sun, turning into personal ovens, and the dust kicked up by thousands of feet choked their throats and lungs, making every breath an agony. The march became torture. When scouts informed Saladin that the Franks had fallen into his trap, he immediately moved his army to meet them. His light horse archers began to encircle the exhausted Christian column, showering them with arrows without engaging in close combat. The Saracens also set fire to the dry grass, and the acrid smoke worsened the Christian suffering, slowing their advance. By evening, still short of Tiberias, the exhausted and completely dehydrated Christian army halted for the night in a dry valley at the foot of the horns of Hattin. There wasn't a drop of water. They were soon completely surrounded by Saladin's army. The night turned into a nightmare. The Saracens gave their enemy no rest, praying loudly and beating their drums incessantly. At dawn on July 4th, the agony began. The infantry, driven mad with thirst, broke formation and charged in a desperate attempt to reach the distant Sea of Galilee. They were almost completely slaughtered or taken captive. The knights were left without cover, huddling in a final desperate formation around the royal tent and the True Cross. Raymond of Tripoli and his contingent of knights managed to break through the encirclement and escape. According to some accounts, Saladin, either respecting him or wishing to be rid of his most dangerous opponent, ordered his men to open their ranks for him. The rest were doomed. The final battle raged on one of the hills. The last pocket of resistance was centered around the red royal tent. Here, led by Guy, Renaud, and the Grand Masters of the Orders, the remnants of the knighthood fought desperately. They repulsed the Saracens twice, but their strength was exhausted. In the heat of the battle, the true cross was captured. With the loss of their holy relic, the Christian spirit was finally broken. The king and all the surviving barons were taken prisoner. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ceased to exist. Thousands of corpses littered the plateau near the Horns of Hattin. The catastrophe was complete, devastating, and final. For the kingdom, this was the end. And for Saladin, this victory was the greatest triumph of his life. After the battle, the most noble prisoners, including King Guy, were brought to the Sultan's tent. The events that followed became legendary, forever defining Saladin's image as a model of chivalrous nobility and, at the same time, unyielding resolve. In that tent, a key scene played out, determining the fates of many. Racked with thirst, Guy could barely stand, awaiting certain death. But Saladin invited him to sit beside him, a sign of the highest honor. The Sultan ordered a cup of iced sherbet to be brought, drank from it himself, and passed it to the king. By the laws of Arab hospitality, to share a drink with a guest was to grant them life and safety. After draining the cup, Guy passed it to Renaud de Chatillon, who was standing nearby. At that moment, Saladin's expression changed. He sternly told the interpreter that it was the king who had given Renaud the drink, not he, the Sultan. With this gesture, he made it clear that his guarantee of safety did not extend to Renaud de Chatillon. The fates of the prisoners were divided. Then Saladin turned to Renaud. He reminded him of all his crimes, breaking oaths, plundering pilgrims, threatening the holy city of Mecca. He offered Renaud the chance to convert to Islam to save his life. When he proudly refused, Saladin stood up, drew his sword, and struck Renaud a blow to the neck, fulfilling his long-held oath. His guards immediately finished the job, beheading the prisoner. The bloody body was thrown before the entrance to the tent. Seeing this, Guy trembled, thinking he was next. But Saladin calmed him, uttering the famous words, "Kings do not kill kings." He added that Renaud, unlike a monarch, had transgressed all bounds, and his execution was an act of justice, not revenge. This episode revealed the essence of Saladin, merciful to an enemy of equal status, yet ruthless towards one he considered a brigand and an enemy of the faith. This same duality determined the fate of the other prisoners. All the captured Templars and Hospitallers faced a terrible end. Saladin considered the warrior monks to be the ideological enemies of Islam and the main pillar of the Frankish state. He offered the 230 captive knights of the orders a choice: convert to Islam or die. Almost all of them chose a martyr's death and were beheaded in front of the entire Muslim army. It was a cruel act, intended to shatter the military power and morale of Outremer. For Guy, however, a long and honorable captivity in Damascus began. While he was imprisoned, his kingdom crumbled before his eyes. The victory at Hattin had destroyed the army and left the entire country defenseless. Guy was a prisoner witness to the agony of the world he had so briefly ruled. Saladin wasted no time. Immediately after the battle, he swept through Palestine. Deprived of their garrisons, cities and fortresses surrendered one after another, often without a fight. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Jaffa, Ascalon all fell. By September 1187, almost the entire kingdom of Jerusalem, except for a few fortresses, and the city of Tyre was in Saladin's hands. Finally, the Sultan approached his main objective, Jerusalem. The city's defense was led by Balian of Ibelin, who had managed to escape captivity at Hattin. There were almost no soldiers in the city, and Balian, in desperation, knighted 16-year-old boys and even common citizens. The siege lasted nearly 2 weeks, and the defenders prepared for a final stand. Saladin, not wanting bloodshed in the Holy City, offered honorable terms of surrender, but the defenders rejected them. When an assault became inevitable and part of the wall was breached, Balian resorted to an extreme measure. He threatened that the defenders would kill all their Muslim prisoners, destroy the Islamic holy sites of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and fight to the last man. The threat worked. The terms of surrender Saladin agreed to were incredibly lenient for the time. All Christians were allowed to leave the city after paying a ransom, 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, and 1 for a child. Everyone remembered the massacre the Crusaders had carried out in 1099. Saladin, however, showed great magnanimity, allowing many of the poor to leave without paying, while his brother purchased and freed thousands of slaves. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin triumphantly entered Jerusalem. After 88 years of Frankish rule, the city was once again Muslim. News of its fall sent a shockwave through the Christian world, was seen as a divine punishment, and prompted the organization of the Third Crusade. Guy de Lusignan, in Damascus, heard all this news. His world was destroyed. It seemed his story was over, and he would forever remain in history as the failed king who lost everything. But fate was preparing one last and most unexpected chance for him. In 1188, Saladin, to the displeasure of many of his advisors, committed what could be considered a mistake. True to his word given over the cup of sherbet, he released Guy from captivity. He made him swear an oath never to take up arms against Muslims again. Once free, Guy immediately found a priest who absolved him of that oath. Upon his release, Guy found himself a king without a kingdom. Almost all his lands had been captured. The only major city that had held out was Tyre. But the defense of Tyre was led by a new, ambitious player who had just arrived from the west, Conrad, Marquis of Montferrat. A new contender for leadership had appeared on the horizon. Conrad of Montferrat, the brother of Sibylla's first husband, proved to be a talented and decisive commander, unlike Guy. He brilliantly organized the defense of Tyre and twice repelled Saladin's attacks, becoming a hero and the savior of the remnants of the kingdom. Many barons now saw him as their leader, not the defeated king. When Guy, along with his wife Sibylla, arrived at the gates of Tyre, he faced the deepest humiliation. Conrad of Montferrat refused to let him in, stating that he was holding the city for the future crusaders from Europe. The king of Jerusalem became an exile in his own kingdom, spending several months in a camp outside the city walls. It seemed he was finally broken. But it was at this moment, at the very nadir of his fall, that Guy showed an unexpected, almost reckless stubbornness. Gathering all who remained loyal to him, a few hundred knights, in August 1189, with the support of the Pisan fleet, he did the unthinkable. He laid siege to the huge and well-fortified city of Acre. This venture was like a mouse trying to swallow an elephant. A tiny force was besieging a massive city with Saladin's entire army at its back. The Sultan, upon hearing of it, initially laughed, certain he could easily crush the insolent band. But he was mistaken. He underestimated Guy's desperate persistence. Thus began the Great Siege of Acre, one of the most epic events of the era, which lasted for nearly 2 years. Guy's camp became a magnet, attracting fresh Christian forces from the East and Europe. The situation was turned on its head. The Christians were besieging the city, while Saladin's huge army, in turn, was besieging their camp. Life in the Christian camp was horrific. Famine, disease, constant attacks from 2 sides. But Guy, who had failed as a field commander, surprisingly proved to be a steadfast and tenacious leader in conditions of siege warfare. He personally took part in the fighting and maintained the morale of his troops. In these new circumstances, he revealed unexpected qualities. In the autumn of 1190, a terrible epidemic struck the camp. Among the thousands of victims were Queen Sibylla and their 2 young daughters. For Guy, this was not only a personal tragedy, but also a political catastrophe. His only claim to the throne had been his marriage to the queen. Now his claim to the crown became extremely dubious. His opponents, led by Conrad of Montferrat, immediately seized on this. The legitimate heiress was now Sibylla's younger sister, Isabella. Conrad's party forcibly abducted her, had her marriage annulled, and immediately married her to Conrad himself. It was a political coup, executed to secure a claim to the throne. Now the remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had 2 kings. The first was Guy de Lusignan, who had lost his legal right to the throne but continued to command the army at Acre. The second was Conrad of Montferrat, married to the rightful heiress. The Christian camp, already suffering from the war, was now split in 2. It was at this moment, in the spring of 1191, that the main forces of the Third Crusade arrived, led by the kings of France and England. Their arrival changed the balance of power, but also brought European politics into the local conflict. King Philip II of France supported his kinsman Conrad, while his eternal rival, Richard the Lionheart, supported his own vassal from Poitou, Guy de Lusignan. Despite these disagreements, the arrival of fresh troops and Richard's siege engines allowed them to gain the upper hand. In July 1191, after a 2-year siege, the garrison of Acre capitulated. It was the first major Christian victory since Hattin. But the political crisis over the crown remained unresolved. The Crusader kings acted as arbiters and reached a compromise. Guy de Lusignan would remain king for the rest of his life. After his death, the crown would pass to Conrad, Isabella, and their heirs. This decision, however, satisfied no one. Soon after, the King of France departed, leaving Richard as the sole leader of the crusade. The local barons of Outremer continued to pressure Richard, demanding that the crown be given to the stronger and more capable Conrad. Guy de Lusignan, the man who had inadvertently started the war and shown unexpected resilience at Acre, was definitively losing all support. His political influence was exhausted. Richard the Lionheart, needing the support of the local barons for his planned march on Jerusalem, was forced to concede. He stripped Guy of his royal title. It seemed to be the final end for Guy. He had lost his wife, his children, his kingdom, and his title. But his powerful patron had other plans for him. Depriving Guy of the crown was an act of pure political pragmatism. Richard had no intention of abandoning his loyal vassal, but he understood he needed the support of the local barons. He couldn't leave Guy landless. That would be dangerous. He needed to find a worthy consolation prize, and such a prize soon appeared. In the spring of 1191, on his way to the Holy Land, Richard's fleet was caught in a storm off the coast of Cyprus. The ship carrying the king's sister and his fiancée was wrecked on the shore. the island's self-proclaimed emperor, Isaac Komnenos, took them captive. When Richard demanded the release of his relatives, he received a defiant refusal. The English king's reaction was lightning fast. Within weeks, Richard and his crusaders crushed Isaac's army, conquered the entire island, and captured the emperor himself, whom, according to legend, he bound in silver chains. Thus, quite unexpectedly, Richard became the owner of an entire island, wealthy and strategically important. Initially, he sold the island to the Knights Templar. However, their rule proved so brutal and inept that a rebellion broke out on Cyprus. The Templars, realizing that governing the island was a troublesome and unprofitable venture, decided to get rid of their problematic purchase as quickly as possible. And here, Richard saw a solution to two problems at once. In May 1192, he struck a deal. He took the island back from the Templars and gave it to Guy de Lusignan. In return, Guy had to definitively renounce all his claims to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The problem of his loyal but unpopular vassal was solved. Thus, the man who lost one kingdom gained another. Becoming the Lord of Cyprus, Guy founded a new dynasty. Taught by bitter experience, he acted not as a conqueror, but as a wise ruler. Although the local Greek population met him with hostility, Guy found a way to consolidate his power on the island. He invited to Cyprus those Frankish barons and knights who had lost their lands in Palestine after Saladin's conquests. He granted them fiefs in exchange for feudal service, creating a fully fledged Western-style feudal system on the island in a very short time. He successfully transplanted the model of Outremer to new soil. Guy ruled Cyprus for only 2 years. He died in 1194, not yet 50 years old, and was buried in the island's capital, Nicosia. He left no direct heirs, and his brother Amory succeeded him. Guy's reign was short, but it was he who laid the foundation for the future prosperity of the new kingdom. And herein lies the main and most surprising paradox of his life. The man whose name is forever linked with the catastrophe and loss of the Kingdom of Jerusalem became the founder of another kingdom, one that proved surprisingly durable. The Lusignan dynasty ruled Cyprus for nearly 300 years, and the island became the last crusader stronghold in the east. So who was Guy de Lusignan? He was no great general, and his indecisiveness led to the tragedy at Hattin. He lacked the courage of Baldwin IV and the cunning of Raymond. However, his incredible tenacity during the 2-year siege of Acre and his pragmatic actions on Cyprus show that he was not the complete incompetent he is often portrayed to be. Perhaps the most accurate description of him is a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a typical member of the second tier of the French aristocracy. Handsome, brave in single combat, but lacking strategic vision. He was lifted to the summit by a twist of fate and a woman's love, and his lack of kingly qualities brought him crashing down. His story is a classic medieval tragedy of the Wheel of Fortune, which first raises a man to unimaginable heights and then mercilessly casts him down. But in Guy's case, fortune made one last turn, granting him a consolation prize at the end of his life that proved more enduring than the great kingdom he had lost. In the court of history, Guy de Lusignan is most often the chief defendant in the case of the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The verdict, passed by his contemporaries and by historians, is harsh. He is guilty. Guilty of weakness, of incompetence, of succumbing to the persuasion of the hawks, and leading his army to a meaningless death. This image of the failed king is firmly rooted in culture, and there are good reasons for such a verdict. The objective facts are relentless. It was during his reign that the decisive battle was lost and Jerusalem fell. History does not favor losers, and his name has become but a pale shadow against the valor of Saladin and the tragic heroism of Baldwin IV. However, if one were to play the role of defense attorney, the picture becomes more complex. Can the blame for a catastrophe that had been brewing for decades be placed on one man who ruled for only a year? Guy did not create the kingdom's problems. He inherited them. The deadly factionalism, the demographic weakness, and above all, a united Islamic world led by a military genius. His fatal mistake, the march on Tiberias, was made under immense psychological pressure. Refusing to save the city and the wife of an influential baron under a barrage of accusations of cowardice could have led to an immediate mutiny in the army and a final loss of power. He was a hostage to the very war party that had put him on the throne. His biography after Hattin, the humiliation, the incredible perseverance at Acre, and the acquisition of a new kingdom on Cyprus, paints a picture of a man far more complex than a cartoonish failure. Fate first gifted him undeservedly, and then tested him cruelly. He failed the main test, but found the strength to rise after his fall. Guy's legacy is paradoxical. He lost Jerusalem, but he founded a dynasty that outlived the kingdom of Jerusalem itself. He entered history as a symbol of devastating defeat, yet his descendants held a royal title for longer than the descendants of many of his victorious contemporaries. His failure and his legacy are utterly disproportionate. Perhaps the true tragedy of Guy de Lusignan is not that he was bad or evil, but that he was an ordinary man. Fate cast him in a role that demanded truly titanic qualities, which he did not possess. He was an actor who could not live up to the scale of his role in a great historical drama, and history has forever typecast him as a tragic failure. Even in this chain of mistakes and defeats, there is a lesson. It speaks of resilience, of how the end of one chapter can be the beginning of another, equally surprising story. This unpredictability of fate is a theme worth discussing. So subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your thoughts in the comments.